In 1971, a ghost hijacked a plane, took $200,000, and vanished into thin air. The FBI chased him for decades, and they came up with nothing. More than 50 years later, no one knows who D.B. Cooper really was. Portland, Oregon, November 24, 1971. A man walks up to the Northwest Orient ticket counter and pays $20 cash for a seat on Flight 305, a routine half-hour hop from Portland to Seattle. He gives his name as Dan Cooper. No one asks for ID. No one checks his bag. In 1971, you could board a commercial flight carrying almost anything, and nobody would say a word. He is slim, somewhere in his mid-40s, dressed like 1,000 other businessmen passing through that terminal. Dark suit, a plain black tie, mirrored sunglasses. Nothing about him stands out. That, it turns out, is entirely the point. He takes his seat at the rear of the plane, orders a bourbon and 7 from stewardess Florence Schaffner, and waits. Calm, unhurried, almost polite. Then, just after takeoff, he hands Florence an envelope. She assumes it's a phone number. A flirtatious stranger on a short flight. She's seen it before. But something in the way he looks at her makes her open it. The note inside is brief and impossible to misread. Mississippi, I have a bomb. I would like you to sit beside me. Florence keeps her composure. She leans in and quietly asks if he is serious. In response, the man opens his briefcase just enough for her to see inside. A nest of red cylinders, wires, and what looks unmistakably like a detonator. He pinches the 2 bare wire ends between his fingers. The message is clear. He doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to threaten anyone twice. He wants $200,000 in cash. He wants 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. And he wants them waiting when the plane lands in Seattle. Northwest Orient agrees immediately. FBI agents race to a Seattle bank and pull $200,000 in $20 bills, each serial number carefully recorded. The parachutes are sourced and rushed to the tarmac. Meanwhile, on board Flight 305, Dan Cooper sips his bourbon, smokes his cigarettes, and waits, patient as a man who has planned every second of this night. When the ransom and parachutes finally arrive, Cooper allows the passengers to leave. He releases Florence too. But the pilots, the remaining crew, and 1 flight attendant named Tina Mucklow stay behind. The plane refuels. The doors close. And Flight 305 climbs back into the dark Pacific Northwest sky. Somewhere above the thick forests of Washington state, at 10,000 feet, with the landing gear still down and the flaps open, a warning light blinks on in the cockpit. The rear staircase has been deployed. Dan Cooper is gone. When Flight 305 finally touched down in Reno, dozens of FBI agents were already waiting on the tarmac. They were ready for a fight, ready for a standoff, ready for almost anything. What they were not ready for was an empty seat. The man who had called himself Dan Cooper, who had held an entire flight crew hostage, extorted $200,000 from a major airline, and somehow convinced everyone on board that he was in complete control, was simply gone. No note, no struggle, no trace, just a black tie left on the seat, a crumpled cigarette butt, and the yawning darkness of the rear staircase still hanging open in the night air. One FBI veteran would later admit what everyone in that hangar was quietly thinking. Nobody had actually believed he would jump. They were wrong. Back in Washington state, the clock was already working against them. The plane's autopilot had followed a known flight path, Route Victor 23, so agents could calculate roughly where Cooper had leapt into the void. Boeing aviation experts crunched the numbers. Factor in the speed of the aircraft, the altitude, the brutal westerly winds howling across the Pacific Northwest that night, and you get a drop zone. A search area. 28 square miles of dense Pacific Northwest wilderness, forest, farmland, river valleys, and darkness. It was Thanksgiving morning, and one of the largest manhunts in American history was about to begin. At first light, the forests outside the tiny town of Ariel, Washington, erupted with activity. Helicopters swept low over the tree canopy. Spotter planes crisscrossed the gray November sky. On the ground, 30 to 40 FBI agents fanned out alongside National Guardsmen, pushing through the undergrowth, checking ravines, scanning riverbanks. The military had mobilized. The Bureau had mobilized. An entire machinery of law enforcement had been pointed at one man in a business suit with a parachute strapped to his back. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a single dollar bill fluttering in the trees. For weeks the search continued, combing the same ground over and over, hoping to find something, anything, that might tell them where Dan Cooper had landed or whether he had survived at all. The forests kept their silence. Back in the press, the story was already taking on a life of its own. A wire service had mistakenly printed his name as D.B. Cooper rather than Dan Cooper. The FBI tried to correct the error, but as one agent would later shrug, D.B. is catchier than Dan. The name stuck, and with it, the legend began to grow. Because here was the thing that nobody could quite get past. The FBI had mobilized an army, searched 28 square miles of wilderness, and interviewed hundreds of ex-paratroopers and pilots across the country. And they had come up completely, utterly, embarrassingly empty. Dan Cooper, or D.B. Cooper, as the world would now call him, had vanished as cleanly as if he had never existed at all. The FBI doesn't like unsolved cases. They especially don't like unsolved cases where a man walks onto a commercial aircraft, extorts a fortune from an airline, leaps into a stormy night sky, and then simply ceases to exist. So through the winter of 1971 and into 1972, agents kept pulling threads, kept chasing names, kept hoping that somewhere, somehow, Dan Cooper had made a mistake. He hadn't. Not one they could find. The investigation pivoted. If Cooper had jumped from a moving aircraft at 10,000 feet and survived, he had to be someone with serious parachuting experience. That narrowed the field, at least in theory. Agents began working through records of hundreds of ex-paratroopers and former military pilots across the country, cross-referencing names, checking backgrounds, knocking on doors. It was exhausting, methodical work, and it led nowhere. Then, in April 1972, the phone lines lit up. A man calling himself James Johnson had hijacked a United Airlines Boeing 727, the same model as Flight 305, demanded $500,000 and 4 parachutes, and leapt from the rear stairs somewhere over Utah. The method was almost identical. The FBI was electrified. Had Cooper struck again? The answer came quickly, and it wasn't Cooper. A tip led agents to the home of Richard McCoy, an ex-Vietnam combat pilot, married with 2 small children. Hidden in a cupboard was a jumpsuit and a bag containing $500,000 in cash. McCoy was arrested. His photograph was shown to every witness who had encountered Cooper on Flight 305. The answer was unanimous. That's not him. McCoy was convicted of the United hijacking and sentenced to 45 years. But the fact that he had survived leaping from a commercial aircraft at altitude kept a crucial idea alive in the public imagination. Maybe Cooper had survived too. The years ticked by, dead end after dead end. Over 1,000 suspects interviewed. Not one of them D.B. Cooper. Then came February 7, 1980. A young boy named Brian Ingram was collecting firewood with his father along the banks of the Columbia River, just outside Vancouver, Washington. As he dug his hands into the sandy soil, his fingers found something unexpected, a corner of decayed paper, rubber bands still wrapped tight around a bundle of rotting bills. He pulled it free. Then another. Then a third. The serial numbers were run against the FBI's records within hours. It was a match. $5,800 of D.B. Cooper's ransom money, buried in a riverbank, 9 years after the hijacking and more than 20 miles from the calculated drop zone. In entirely the wrong direction from where the wind had been blowing that night. The FBI was baffled. Geologists determined the money had arrived there no earlier than 1974, at least 3 years after Cooper's jump. Some investigators wondered whether Cooper himself had come back, whether this was a taunt, a ghost rattling his chains. But if it was Cooper leaving a message, he left nothing else. No more money was ever found in circulation. No more bills turned up in the riverbank. No body. No trace. Just 3 bundles of rotting 20s, and a mystery that was somehow growing deeper with every answer they thought they had found. After nearly 4 decades, everything the FBI had on D.B. Cooper fit inside a single small box. A black tie and tie pin, an open parachute pack, a plane ticket, a few samples of rotting ransom money. That was it. That was the entire physical record of a man who had pulled off the most audacious aerial heist in American history and then dissolved into the night like he was never real to begin with. But FBI Special Agent Larry Carr wasn't ready to close the book. And he was starting to think that everything the investigation had assumed about Cooper, right from the very beginning, might have been wrong. The early FBI profile had painted Cooper as a hardened, experienced skydiver, a military man, someone who had jumped from aircraft before and knew exactly what he was doing. But when Carr sat down and examined every choice Cooper had made that night, really examined them, a very different picture began to emerge. Cooper had shown up with no specialist clothing for a nighttime jump in freezing conditions. No gloves, no goggles, no thermal gear. He had failed to specify the denomination of his ransom money, which meant he ended up carrying 23 pounds of $20 bills instead of the 5 pounds he would have carried in hundreds. A professional would never have made that mistake. And then there was the parachute. Given a choice between a maneuverable sport chute and a military NB-8, Cooper had chosen the NB-8, a notoriously stiff, uncomfortable rig with a ripcord so flat it was nearly impossible to locate in the dark. The man who packed those parachutes was baffled. A seasoned skydiver would never have made that choice. Not in a million years. Carr's conclusion was quietly revolutionary. Cooper was probably not the expert everyone had been hunting for 30 years. Then, in 2007, a new suspect emerged from an unexpected direction. A New York private investigator named Skip Porteous was contacted by a man with a striking claim. He believed his own brother was D.B. Cooper. That brother was Kenneth Christensen, a former flight attendant for Northwest Orient Airlines who had died years earlier. Christensen had known the exact planes, the schedules, the layout of the aircraft. He had grievances over pay cuts and redundancies in the early 70s. And just 1 year after the hijacking, he had purchased a large house in Washington state, in cash, on a salary of around $150 a week. When Florence Schaffner, the stewardess who had sat beside Cooper that night, was shown Christensen's photograph, she said it looked more like D.B. Cooper than any other photo she had ever been shown. The FBI remained unconvinced. Resemblance and circumstance, they said, were not evidence. But perhaps the most intriguing clue of all came not from any suspect, but from that plain black tie Cooper had left behind on his seat. Paleontologist Tom Kay examined it under a microscope and found something remarkable: microscopic particles of pollen. And the pollen told a story Cooper never intended to tell. It had been deposited in spring, not in November, meaning Cooper had worn that tie months before the hijacking, in a specific place, at a specific time of year. If the right pollen species could be identified, it could point investigators toward the region where this man had actually lived. Who was Dan Cooper? The mystery wasn't just alive. It was growing. For nearly 4 decades, the question had haunted the FBI, captivated the American public, and turned a sleepy town in Washington into a pilgrimage site for true believers. Did D.B. Cooper survive? Now, for the first time, science was ready to offer an answer, and it was darker than most people wanted to hear. Paleontologist Tom Kay had spent months poring over every scrap of evidence locked inside that small, unassuming box at the FBI's Seattle office. The tie, the parachute, the recovered bills. But it was those 3 moldy bundles of cash, pulled from a Columbia River sandbar by a boy collecting firewood, that told the most chilling story of all. The money had traveled. That much was certain. But how? Tom's calculations traced everything back to the night of the jump, approximately 8:10 p.m., the moment cabin pressure shifted aboard Flight 305. At that precise instant, the plane was passing directly over the Lewis River. If the bank bag, whipped and battered by 200-mile-per-hour winds, had torn free from Cooper's grip, it would have plummeted straight down into those dark, fast-moving waters below. And Cooper himself? His chosen parachute, the NB-8, was not maneuverable. It would carry him wherever the wind decided. And that night, the wind had only one direction in mind: west, directly toward water, toward Lake Merwin, toward the Lewis River, toward something close to a death sentence. The water temperature that November night was near freezing. Even for a fit, experienced man, which Cooper may not have been, the cold would have been merciless. Weighed down by 20 pounds of cash, tangled in harness straps and 30 feet of parachute cord, his window for survival would have been measured not in hours, but in agonizing minutes. When D.B. Cooper hit the water, he would have had only a matter of minutes in that type of cold to make it to shore. Tom believed he didn't make it. The semi-buoyant body, Tom theorized, would have drifted downstream, some 20 miles along the fast-running Lewis River until it reached the Columbia. From there, the busiest shipping lane in North America would have done the rest. A ship's propeller, churning upriver, could have snagged both the body and the disintegrating bank bag, dragging them upstream, scattering 3 bundles of cash onto a sandbar just miles from where the two rivers met. As for D.B. Cooper himself, the Columbia River, Tom said quietly, is going to suck up your body and spit it out into the ocean. He may be there still, nameless, undiscovered, a legend dissolved into the deep. There would be no triumphant ending, no arrest, no courtroom, no confession, just a tie left on a seat, a boy digging through sand, and a theory as cold and unforgiving as the water that, in all probability, swallowed Dan Cooper whole on the night before Thanksgiving, 1971. The story had no final chapter, and perhaps that was exactly how he would have wanted it.